Okay, well, I think we'll still have people trickling in over the next few minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We're so grateful to have all of you here today and excited to hear some of the great stuff that Dr. White-Newsome has to share with us. My name is Jennifer Stoll, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. And then after she is done presenting, Amanda Hoffman-Hall is going to run our Q&A. So Dr. White-Newsome founded Empowering a Green Environment and Economy, which is a consulting firm that tries to help communities through the development of people-centered solutions. So her clients generally are forward-thinking, and they are looking to tackle issues such as climate change and public health and other environmental topics. She has experience in several different areas. She's worked in environmental philanthropy, government, nonprofit organizations, academia, private industries, and among probably many others. She was also key in implementing the Climate Resilient and Equitable Water Systems Initiative at the Kresge Foundation. She has also served as the director of We Act for Environmental Justice's Federal Policy Office in Washington, D.C. And she received her doctorate from the University of Michigan, and it centered on the impact of climate change and extreme heat on low income and elderly in Detroit. So we'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Dr. White-Newsome, and we're really excited and happy to have you here today.
All right, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So first and foremost, it is Friday, and so I just appreciate you all being here. Maybe some of you can relate. This is the last day of school for my daughters. So I feel like I'm getting out of school. So hopefully I will make a little bit of sense, because I am jumping for joy inside. Glad the year is over. But I do want to thank Jen and her team and AGU, and of course the GeoHealth Section for having these multiple conversations and allowing me to spend a little bit of time with you all. So first and foremost, before I jump in, I'm calling from the hot southeastern Michigan and a little bit outside of Detroit, and on the original lands of the Potawatomi. And I say that because, again, really am grateful for where I'm at, but also grateful for the legacy that I've been able to hopefully build here because of the folks that came before me. So I think that's super important to recognize and acknowledge. And so I guess for the next couple moments, want to think about this question of climate change, but particularly around unequal impact, because we all feel, did somebody say something? Okay. We all feel climate change in some way. But of course, that impact is unequal. And I'm sure most of you are aware, or hopefully will be more aware after this conversation. But I think it's also important to think about resilience and what that means in this space, and how we can be a part of redefining resilience. So with that, I really want to start out with some definitions, because there are so many definitions of resilience. And I remember the first time I heard about resilience was kind of it being likened to a rubber band, and a rubber band being stretched. And when it's unstretched, that it should bounce back into its original form. But I would guarantee that once that rubber band is stretched, it never gets back to its original form. But that's how resilience has been, was really my first definition. But then thinking about resilience in terms of how the dictionary defines it, this ability to recover, and then FEMA, our emergency management agency, and who coordinates response to a lot of extreme weather events and other things, but being able to, again, recover from disruption and adapt to changing conditions. I think all very valid definitions. But one that I came across a couple of years ago that I think has stuck with me was this definition from a community-based organization in Los Angeles. and saying basically that the purpose of resilience is not to be able to deal with more harm, but it's actually to be more skillful in confronting the systems that have harmed us. And I think this whole piece around systems is critical, and one that I will build on, hopefully. But before I jump into that, I think it's important that you understand kind of my context and where I come from. And as I think about my first introduction to systems and my introduction to justice, it was when I was a high school intern in Michigan. And I wanted to be a chemical engineer. So I had an opportunity to be a part of a mentoring program with Dow Chemical Corporation in Midland, Michigan. And, I learned about a lot about what a chemical engineer does every day. But one of the other things I learned about was, environmental justice, and the fact that some of the chemicals that we were making and that were being transported across the country, there seemed to be more accidents from those trucks and those railways in low-income communities and communities of color. And this is something that I end up studying and thinking about while I was at my internship. But the fact is that in addition to those spills, again, more air pollution, more landfills, more waste, all those different pieces were like situated in these communities that look like the communities that I came from. And so this realization in high school and going back home and seeing some of the same scenarios made it real to me that something wasn't right, that this was an unnatural reality that a lot of communities were experiencing. And so when I headed off to Chicago to go to undergrad, again, focused in engineering, but I always had a passion for journalism. And so one of my first articles that made it to the front page of the Northwestern Daily was around and on environmental justice, particularly in the South Side of Chicago, where I got a chance to interview the founder and leader of People of Community Recovery. And again, this community on the South Side was dealing with lead smelters and the remnants of, and all sorts of environmental injustice going on. And again, just enlightened for me that this injustice was not just a Michigan thing. It wasn't a Detroit thing, but it was in other places. And so the whole connection to climate change and climate injustice came when I was taking care of my grandparents. And they are pictured here. And of course, they are now in heaven. But when they were in their 80s and 90s, they really started to have a hard time dealing with extreme heat and temperatures. And when I was trying to figure out kind of resources and people and social services to help them, whether it was weatherizing their home or making sure that their medication didn't have any detrimental effects to how they dealt with heat, it was really hard. And I realized that this just wasn't an issue that my grandparents was dealing with, but it was really the other senior citizens in their community. And really the fact that across the city of Detroit, where I'm from, there wasn't a level of education and understanding of the impact of extreme heat and what it could do to, again, vulnerable communities. And so that's what led to my dissertation work. And, again, it was purely trying to figure out how to take care of my grandparents and others, but also with the focus of figuring out how can my research be used to help the city of Detroit's health department or the Detroit Area Agency on Aging actually create programs and policies and put in other practices to reduce the vulnerability and the risk of these different communities. And so I looked at heat waves, particularly indoor heat exposure, where folks spend a lot of their time, particularly our aged folks, and looking at the outside environment and what was the temperature, outside the home versus inside the home. And then what were the behaviors that folks were using to adapt to heat, or what were they not doing that they should be doing? So all of this really, again, pointed to the fact that there were some folks that were suffering more from heat, and we needed to figure out a way to deal with this. This was definitely an issue of environmental injustice. And so again, it became clear to me in my postdoc that this was not, again, just a Michigan situation. And the fact that the level of response and preparedness across some of our agencies that act as first responders, our local health departments, it was a little bit concerning Because again, the emphasis, the focus, and the readiness and the education around extreme heat and the impacts it could have on populations, it was not there. I mean, a couple of your big health departments, of course, were on it and addressing it. But again, there were a lot where heat was not a priority because of the other competing priorities and really the lack of resources in these health departments. So again, what this study uncovered was that, there were minimal numbers of heat plans in place. The communication was not there. There was not the emphasis, support, financial capacity, or the human capacity to really effectively deal with this challenge. And that was about 10 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. But today, this article that was printed a couple days ago, there is still this challenge in Detroit and across our country. And so again, we talk about this risk of health impacts and the fact that housing can be hazardous to our health, not only with lead, but as it relates to heat and the lack of access to air conditioning, or even folks being able to open their windows. And the fact that even in this COVID crisis that, when you think about how some of the public facilities to, keep folks cool, like cooling centers, are they actually being used? Can they actually be used? Do people actually want to go to cooling centers? Or moreover, can people actually get to cooling centers, particularly as you move from not only the seniors and other folks, but our houseless communities and folks that don't have a physical home, but are living outside and are sometimes unwelcome into these public spaces, particularly when there's extreme temperatures like many of us are experiencing now. So this is still a reality. Unfortunately, 10 years later, we're talking about the same thing. And so again, a day ago, yesterday, I think I became aware, a colleague sent me of this paper that again talks about this disproportionate impact of heat across US cities. And as most of you know, this is not rocket science. And, again, heat is like this invisible threat that continues to cause more sickness and more death that needs to be, again, paid more attention to. But, as you think about this profile of who's vulnerable, and I hate really, calling folks vulnerable, because really it is the systems that make people, the systems that make communities vulnerable. But this study by the National Academies of Sciences a couple years ago really laid out the characteristics of those that were vulnerable to floods. And I would even posit that these same folks or these same characteristics are also can be made vulnerable to other climate threats. But I'm gonna focus on flooding now because that is a huge climate impact as well. So when you see it's a relative to income, if you rent or own your home, racial and ethnic diversity, educational attainment, again, all these different characteristics that can increase your vulnerability. And again, this hit home with me because my family, my parents, and these are pictures of their home, unfortunately experienced flooding in their home, up to 4 and 5 feet of water due to climate-driven flooding, some due to just old mains in their East Side home in the city of Detroit. And again, what spoke to me is that this is not a new issue. And I'm just using Detroit as a representative city, but there are other cities where people continue to deal with climate-driven flooding. And the cost of flooding, again, is not just around these huge events and hurricanes that we see in the news, but it is these communities that continue to deal with recurrent flooding, that have dilapidated infrastructure that hasn't been maintained. And then the fact that these flooding events keep on happening over and over again. So it's not just that you're losing stuff that you're, which is super important, that you're being displaced from your home, but the trauma and the mental health impacts associated with that can be huge. And so, a couple of folks in Southeastern Michigan, you can see the entities at the bottom of the screen. We are actually, the report on household flooding in Detroit is coming out in the next couple of days that really tries to, again, highlight this issue that has not been amplified and really ways to tackle it and what folks and communities should do to prevent a flood, but also what to do during a flood. Because again, when you talk about those recurring health issues and your exposures, whether it be mold or other things, that can have long-term detrimental health impacts. And so as we think about these health inequities, whether it's with heat or flooding, one of the things that has always kind of burned me up is when people suggest that a lot of the things that people experience are a fault of their own, particularly as it relates to communities of color and poor communities, that they have chosen to live in a community that's next to a power plant, or they've chosen to eat bad food and that's not good for them. Those choices, again, are not random occurrences. It is the fact that in many cases, there is a history there that has created a system, has created structures or policies that prevent folks from achieving a healthy, wonderful environment that we all want to live in. And so really honing in on this fact that the inequities and the injustices that we see are not typically connected to the person, but it is more so a systemic challenge. And so as you think about systems and institutions that are really put forth to protect us, our education system, our housing system, our justice system, I posit that these systems are actually broken and not the people. And the fact that we continue to see this brokenness play out in many different ways is because in many cases, we're not getting down to what is actually causing the brokenness. And so when we also leave people out of the solution and out of the equation, and we don't have any accountability from these structures, again, the same folks that was in that chart a couple of slides ago continue to suffer. And I feel like it's been a wonderful opportunity to experience many different sectors throughout my career. But the unfortunate reality is that I see kind of the same thread. And, you know, institutional racism drives that unequal impact. It drives climate injustice. It drives health disparities. And as I think about my time in philanthropy, and what you're seeing a lot of now is really this realization that's not new, but it's been around for 20, 30 years, that there are certain organizations, particularly organizations that are not led by people of color or Indigenous people, that have always gotten the most funds. And that's not right. We see that industry, and I spent about 15 years working in manufacturing facilities across the country, that this notion of producing that widget or profit always, I won't say the word, well, it always trumps over the needs of people. And when it comes to, again, research and what's deemed as important, or best practice, and what data is the best, and who gets the data and how it's processed, all those pieces are part of these institutional dynamics that we need to really unpack and change if we're actually going to get to this notion of environmental justice and equity, and get rid of disparities. And so we know that all these impacts, again, hit us physically. They damage our communities. But again, the one thing that I really have been thinking about a lot is the mental health piece, because that has often not been as pronounced. Now it's been more pronounced since we've been unfortunately dealing with this COVID pandemic, but we have to realize that many of these communities are dealing with multiple layers of vulnerability. So it's not just COVID, but it's COVID plus the pre-existing stuff. It's COVID plus the lack of enforcement that actually happens in these communities and allows different sources to pollute more than others. It's COVID plus, again, the devaluing of grassroots expertise and their brilliance and the solutions that come from the ground up that aren't paid attention to sometimes. So again, those multiple layers of vulnerability make it, again, the climate threat even larger for certain communities. And so enough about talking about the problem and the issue, but how do we begin to address this unequal impact that I hope is fairly clear? That again, we all are, feel climate change in some way, but some of us feel it a little bit differently. And so I think that comes to how we define resilience. And so I'll again point back to the definition that I offered before by that organization: building resilience to be more skillful in confronting the systems that have harmed us. And I want to offer, 4 things. I could probably make a super duper long list, but I tried to really think about it in 4 ways. If we're going to be redefining resilience, in a way that helps us achieve climate justice and environmental justice. We have to begin by respecting people. We have to reduce the source. We have to begin to recognize and address racism, and definitely reevaluate our priorities. So I'll get into those a little bit more with some examples. So let's start with respecting people. And I just wanted to share and not assume that most of you have or may not have been aware of the Hermes Principles for Democratic Organizing. This was something that was developed in the mid-90s by SNEEJ and the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. And really, it is something that I have used when you're bringing different groups, organizations together to try and work together on something. And so I think these principles can, speak to many different situations, whether it's, again, the emphasis on bottom-up organizing, self-transformation, being inclusive. These are all things that I think we should practice in whatever spaces we are. So when you talk about respecting people, it's also making sure that the process respects them. And so this is, again, just a framework that I hope you all will check out if you haven't heard about it. But I think what's important is that I think about my days when I was the federal policy director at WEAC, and part of what we were trying to do was get the voices of people respected within our federal agencies, particularly around the Clean Power Plan. And it was wonderful to see, again, which we're seeing even more so of it now, that voices from across the country that have this lived experience and solutions are being raised up and pulled into these policy circles to help create something that will hopefully not only benefit the community, but the movement in general. So again, that respect is around making sure voices are being heard, and not just heard, but actually used. And I want to also talk about, the work that I did with the Kresge Foundation. And this initiative around climate resilient and equitable water systems was, I think, transformative. And that is the words of one of my grantees, because what we attempted to do was to get folks to understand the different languages and the different experiences, and kind of, again, respect the person's perspective, and then figure out how we can work together. So this group of folks was, again, community-based organizations, water utility leaders, economists, researchers, a whole bunch of folks that were all working on water, or had an interest in really transforming water systems so it benefited communities. And I think what was amazing was that folks were not only appreciating the climate change piece and the importance of science, but also the equity piece and what it meant for them to actually implement that in how they did their work. And so this was, again, an example of learning to really respect different folks, I would say, levels of experience and expertise, and figure out, how do you bring this all together under an equity frame? And what I think was also really, I think amazing was that oftentimes, when you talk about respecting people and respecting voices, there are certain voices that continue to be, I would say, muffled by the majority. And particularly in the water space and in other spaces, there are a set of folks that always kind of like lay out the policy plan or create the platform. And for water and climate resilience in general, or in particular, there was not an entity, a network, or a group of folks that had ever come together to talk about, how do we really shake up federal water policy and then trickle that down to the states and local level. And so I was really, blessed to be able to support the formation of the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which has been around for about 3 or 4 years now, and now has upwards of 90 plus members, all representing different community-based organizations, frontline organizations, social justice organizations across the country, all working on water. And they have actually been a significant part of shaping some of the movement on the Hill around legislation, particularly around water affordability and climate resilience. And so again, this notion of respecting people's voices, respecting different platforms is critical. Also, when you talk about the importance of people, it's important, again, to realize that humility is key, and being able to step back to allow someone else to step forward, particularly if their voice has not been heard. the importance of leadership, having good leaders and different types of leaders that bring different types of experiences and points of view, and making sure that you have implementers, because a lot of folks do a lot of talking, but again, giving folks the chance that have had, you know, that experience in doing to be a part of the solution is critical. So we'll move to recognizing racism. And again, I want to start out with some principles and offer this just in case folks don't know, but you know, again, in the early 90s, organizations came together and developed these principles of environmental justice. And for any, you know, environmental justice organization, if they don't do stuff that adheres to these principles, then I would not call them an environmental justice organization. I think these principles are so beautiful because they touch on really not only the sacredness of Mother Earth, but what are the things that we should be thinking about and doing as a part of this broader movement. And so I still look at them even in my consulting practice just to remind myself and guide my work and my thinking. And I think, again, just like the Jimenez principles for democratic organizing, these are things that organizations that may not have begun to develop partnerships with community-based organizations or don't have that kind of orientation would be helpful to check out and look at. And so when you talk about recognizing racism, I think one of the key pieces is within our institutions. And I've had the opportunity over the past couple of months to facilitate roundtables across the state of Michigan, particularly to understand what is the expanse and scope of environmental injustice that's happening across the state, from our rural places to our cities. And what this is going to do, again, is really uncover some of the racism that is happening at the local levels and really give the state and the new Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate a way to kind of integrate those learnings into a broader plan. That you can begin to address and tackle some of these issues. And so again, having conversations, sometimes hard conversations, sometimes very sensitive conversations, and really calling out racism is what's needed to actually recognize it and address it. I want to also uplift this wonderful work of Groundwork USA, who, again, they're a national organization with what they call trust or chapters across the country. And this has probably gotten a lot of press because they've done this work around this Climate Safe Neighborhoods initiative. And this is some work that I was able to fund at Kresge that basically, you know, took redlining maps, you know, the historical you know, maps that, you know, only allowed certain communities to live in certain places that oftentimes didn't have infrastructure, didn't have anything. And, you know, again, didn't allow folks to buy homes, you know, and this was like a government sanctioned policy, this redline. And so you can see redlining maps from across the country. But what also, as you think about that redlining, you think about, okay, so what is the impact of climate in these places? And so oftentimes in these redlined areas, which were deemed not good, you see more concrete, you see more flooding happening and all sorts of other things. And so what Groundwork USA has done and what other folks have really been doing now is kind of looking at this historical context, looking at the legacy pollution, and really, you know, overlaying that with the current situation that we're seeing in our communities, particularly around climate change. And so again, this is another obvious way that, you know, either recognizing how racism has actually shifted and made communities to be more vulnerable because of these historic practices that were allowed. And really the question is, you know, how are we actually, you know, making that worse? And how can we actually make that better if we think a little bit harder about the decisions that we make? The next one is really reducing the source. And the source here is a couple different ways. So as you think about climate justice, I mean, you know, part of this is actually reducing the sources of emissions that are driving climate change. And so that is always a good thing. But what I want to, you know, kind of put out there is that, you know, while reducing the source is a good thing, we have to make sure that the ways that we're reducing sources and possibly the unintentional consequences that come from that are taken into the equation. I'm working with MIT and a couple of folks on really studying the environmental justice implications of vehicle electrification. Again, this is more so focused in the Midwest, even though the broader study covers the United States, but essentially looking at communities in 6 cities. And really my task is to think about, well, what are the health implications? What are the environmental justice implications of this transition? And oftentimes, again, coming from manufacturing, and some of that time I spent in auto manufacturing, there again are these facilities that either transition to making something else or they transition to nothing, just being an eyesore in a community or becoming a brownfield. But also, as you think about the justice implications around who can access electric vehicles, or who can afford them, where the charging stations will be, what will be the battery waste that's generated and where that battery waste is going to go. And so again, with this great idea of reducing one of the major sources of air pollution, particularly in urban communities and particularly in communities that are near highways or off highways or have been cut by highways because of racial practices, this is an important solution. But we have to make sure that the solution actually benefits everyone, or how can we make it where we have policies in place so this EV, this electrification for vehicles will again benefit our most needy communities. I think also the source and the opportunity is really working with those organizations and institutions that have the power to change practices that impact millions of people. I'm working with an organization in Canada that provides regional services, affordable housing, climate change planning, liquid waste. And I think what's so important is that, oftentimes what people are feeling on the ground is a result of what's happening, in somebody's boardroom, decisions that are made around the table. And so until we begin to change the way decisions are made, until we begin to change the way practices or people do their practice or do their job, we will continue to see the stuff that we don't want to see on the ground. So when I talk about the source in this sense, it's the source of power. How are we making sure that the folks with power and privilege and decision-making ability, are beginning to have an equity analysis in the work that they are pushing? So it's really been very interesting to think about justice and equity across all these different facets, and particularly in a country that really emphasizes social equity versus racial equity. Again, but it's getting at that source, really getting those folks in power to really understand the ramifications of their decisions, go way beyond them. The other piece, when you talk about the source, is the power of planning. Planners, if I could go back to school for anything, I would probably be a planner. Planning is so important. I mean, you determine where things sit, if a house is going to sit next to a plant, all these different things. And what I've tried to do is kind of compile some practices for advancing equitable climate planning in a chapter that's coming out late this fall, my colleague and I. And so really thinking about how do we advance climate planning in a way that builds on some of these, tangible ways that we can, again, implement in our work. So whether it's an equity analysis or, again, looking at the data sources that we're using, technical assistance, things of that nature. So again, getting at the source, what are those things upstream that we can begin to change that will have the effects that we want to see downstream. And last but not least is reevaluating priorities. And I'm a big person. Well, I think one of the things that we don't do enough of, I mean, we often, and, I can kind of nerd out on creating indicators and metrics, but one of the things that I've been seeing that has been missing in the field are really metrics and indicators focused on equity and justice. And so one of the things that I worked on while I was at the foundation was really creating a group of partners, and these are, again, that diverse group of partners, to really figure out what would be a good set of equity metrics to really measure our progress and collective impact in this field of climate resilience and equitable water systems. And so, I'm still working with the foundation in a consultant capacity, but it's been really interesting. It's a hard process. But my hope is that what comes out of this is not just a set of pretty indicators and metrics, but it will also help us figure out how to prioritize where resources should be spent, where there are still pain points, where things need to be leveraged a little bit better to, again, meet the needs of these low-income communities and communities of color as they're dealing with climate-driven flooding. So really having metrics and using those to prioritize where resources flow, where efforts need to go is essential. I also want to, again, uplift the fact that this administration, is moving forward in so many different ways to keep environmental justice and equity a priority. And, the Justice 40 initiative or, plan, of course, is that 40% of all benefits from the federal government and federal investments will flow to disadvantaged communities. And there are many federal agencies that are trying to really figure out what that means and how they're going to do that. And I think, again, this is important because one of the things that have been a concern for me is that, you have all these resources, potential resources out there, but how do you prioritize where those resources go? Because oftentimes the places where the resources need to go, either one, aren't able to absorb those resources. They don't have the infrastructure or the capacity. They might not have the technical assistance to apply for the resources or know the process. There's so many barriers that can keep this from actually being successful. And so I was really excited to see this Justice 40 Accelerator, which is trying to do just that, prioritizing communities that most need these investments and giving them the structure and the help to help access those resources. So again, this prioritization is critical because I truly believe if we begin to take care of our most disadvantaged communities, we will all do better. Another thing that's super important that I've been working on is this notion of investments. And, there's so much data out there, but there's a recent news release or article that really talks about the top philanthropies and how they're disclosing their giving to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations. And it's actually taken a pledge to support these organizations more that are fighting for climate change. And you'll see, if you can, if it's not too little, a couple of the foundations that have taken on that pledge. And I'm happy that Kresge and others are part of that. But I think even beyond the philanthropic giving, there is a lot of money out there on the social investment side, so social impact investing, as well as market rate investing, that again, there's opportunity to address climate change and climate injustice in the way that you do that. And I've been working with, again, another client and a couple of folks, and this is something that I had, kind of dreamed up, but, what are the questions that we need to ask at the start or before a transaction happens that will, again, prioritize the outcomes that we want to see? If we're a foundation or if we're an investment organization or a mutual fund or a firm, or we're creating a municipal bond market, if we want to make sure investments make it into these communities that are experiencing the most egregious climate threats, how do we ensure that our investments follow? And so again, it's not rocket science, but it's making sure that we're asking the questions and we're having the framework in place that can facilitate the vision that we want to see, which is making sure our communities are taken care of and they get the resources that they need. And then when you think about, kind of science and research and discovery, and I have an opportunity to really learn a little bit more about this as a member of the advisory board for NIHS. And, I've always, said and tried to do, again, in my research, and even as I mentor other students, that, where there's an opportunity, think about your research agenda. Co-create it with the folks that you want to be in service to. How are you going to make your research useful and usable, and really to push the change that you want to see? And, oftentimes I hear that, and actually I see this a lot too. It's like, research for research's sake is one thing, but I think how can we begin to focus our research, not just on the problems that we already know, but on the solutions? how do we begin to amplify that and kind of share these best practices and share what's working? So again, more communities can benefit from it. I think it's always important to actually track what's working, particularly in the extreme heat space. I feel like there is a lot of different organizations and entities that are doing some really innovative and creative things around education and adaptation. But, one of the questions that I continue to ask, how do we know what's working? And how can we begin to track that and monitor that and share that out? And the importance of partnership in this space, if we are going to actually achieve climate justice and, really address and reduce the risk for certain communities, partnership is critical. So it's really, I would say, kind of getting out of kind of your norm of folks that see things like you, that that someone that will stretch you. So how can you create and expand your partner so you will be able to, again, maybe enhance your research in a way that you had never thought about, or begin to explore different questions that might not have come, across your mind because, again, of your point of view. So partnership, particularly in research and discovery, is so critical. And making sure, and I put a picture at the bottom of this Climate and Energy Justice PhD database that was just started by the Donors of Color Network. But again, how do you begin to expand who your research partners are and what they're focused on? And I think that is so critical in science and research and discovery. So I want to close by simply saying, and I truly believe this, that we need to redefine resilience, because the cost of inaction and the cost of not doing things, the cost of ignoring the brokenness of our systems will keep us from getting where we want to be. And one of the quotes I love that I often share from Thurgood Marshall is just dissenting from this indifference. It's no longer tolerable. We have to, because America can do better. And I truly believe that we can get there. So with that, thank you so much. And hopefully I didn't put you to sleep on this Friday, and I will turn it over to maybe.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. White-Newsome. That was an incredible presentation, and we so appreciate you spending so much of your time and energy in preparing that for us and then presenting it to us, especially on a Friday afternoon, as you mentioned. So I would love to take any questions that the audience had. However you all feel like you would like to ask your question, feel free to put it in the chat if that works easiest for you, and I will read it to Dr. White-Newsome. Or if you prefer to unmute yourself and speak, please just raise your hand. It looks like we actually have Rebecca raised her hand. So Rebecca, if you want to go ahead and unmute and get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And great to see you, Jalonne. Thanks so much for this presentation. I think you outlined so well, I think the planning process and how we need to put these goals and lay out how we want to incorporate equity and justice into planning so that it's seen throughout. And I think and then on the last slide, you had a bullet about implementation. And I just want to dig in a little bit more on implementation and enforcement, because I think we work so hard to build equity in at the beginning, and there's been focus on that. And I worry that then the enforcement and implementation side of it gets overlooked. And how can we support efforts, particularly in Justice 40, at the federal government level, but of course at all levels, about building justice and equity into enforcement? And are there different mechanisms actually that we can employ through enforcement that can build environmental justice?
Yeah, Rebecca, I think your point is well taken. And a lot of the work that I'm doing now is just that, The fancy word is operationalizing equity, because I think there is a process to get to kind of like a shared vision of what equity means in whatever space that you're working, and to write a set of principles, but how you actually put those into practice is where the rubber meets the road. And what I've found is that one of the, I would say, I don't want to say the biggest barriers, but is that people really don't know, either what equity means or how it relates to what they're doing. And so really taking the time to tease that out, like particularly, sometimes on the finance side, I was speaking with someone, they were like, yeah, equity is kind of what I have in my home. What does this mean in what I do every day? I'm balancing, I'm doing accounting. So, and that is like a real, real conversation I had, which is cool. But again, it's like, that is the opportunity, really having these conversations about what it means to me in the space that I'm at, and then making sure that there are easy, tangible ways to put that into practice. Because if you don't make that plain, if you don't spend that time like saying, okay, well, if we're planning to put in this water pump in this community, what are the questions that we should be asking? What are the things that we should be thinking about? And part of what I've tried to set up for certain organizations is a set of questions that they ask before every big decision, like just something easy, something that you can mesh into your process. So it's not like this equity thing that we have to do beyond, but how do you mesh it and integrate it into what you're already doing? What is going to be that like trigger point that says, oh, we can't move forward until we begin to ask these questions? And so I think that's one of the approaches that, that I've taken, not saying it's the only, but, even when you talk about enforcement, and it's been so, it's been a breath of fresh air. Gosh, I want to say a couple of weeks ago, EPA Administrator Regan was speaking at one of our environmental justice conferences in the state of Michigan. And just the fact that he noted that there were some processes that he actually stopped because they were having detrimental effects. And I want to say it was one of the island nations. I can't remember exactly, but so that whole notion of enforcement, I think is coming back. But I remember very distinctly when I was in state government that, enforcement is only as good as the number of people that you have actually doing it. So you can have all these laws and regulations on the books, but, we had maybe a couple of inspectors covering an entire state, which is ridiculous. When I was in the plant and responsible for our air permits in the state of Texas, how many times did an inspector come out and check on us? I actually had to call them and ask questions. So my hope is that the enforcement will increase, but that takes capacity, human capacity, and I think, but that's the only way that we're actually going to have some accountability, in any of the systems that you're talking about, whether it's enforcement or some type of checks and balances. Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit, or maybe gives you more questions.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat. So this is from Rebecca Beavers. Apologies. I hope I said your name correctly. But they want to know, how can climate scientists that are in federal agencies with land management roles like Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, et cetera, how can they apply the principles of environmental justice to advance climate justice on their federally managed areas that they are overseeing?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. Number two, I think one of the first things, I was having a conversation with someone, and someone had said this term, conservation justice, that I had never heard of. And I think when you are kind of in a government role, the first thing that I would suggest is talking to the people. And I would say, particularly as it relates to land and parks and nature, finding out, are there indigenous peoples or, folks that are kind of in the spaces where you're working, and really garnering their advice. And that whole notion of building trust and building partnership is so critical, because I think, one, your expertise in climate science, coupled with their expertise in the land and just the ways and the historical care and stewardship of the land, that could be a powerful thing. And I bet some cool, innovative ideas could come out of just beginning to have those conversations and not having the fear to have those conversations, but also acknowledging that in many cases, when you are trying to build partnership, and not all cases, but sometimes there's a kind of a, I would say reconciliation that is necessary because of past hurts due to governments doing this and that. So I would say, again, beginning to reach out and build those relationships and have those conversations with Indigenous peoples, with those that, again, see the land as a person. And then again, having the humility to understand that it might not be a quick and easy relationship thing because there might be some past harms, and acknowledging that. But again, coming in with again, this sense of humility and wanting to help and serve in that way, I think is kind of the best position that, I would suggest if you're trying to really think about and apply those principles of environmental justice.
Yes, thank you. But one follow-up on that, because we do have a traditional process for consultation that does exist, are you suggesting any revisions or nuances to that type of consultation process? Or is it just a growing awareness and an openness to have more broader topics on the table?
So, Rebecca, I am not going to pretend that I know kind of the ins and outs of your consultation process. So what I was speaking to was really that relationship piece. But what I will say, and I don't know if this relates to you or not, so you can totally scrap it, but I've been having, again, some conversations with folks in Canada, again, we're First Nations and kind of the relationship. It's a huge deal. And one of the folks shared with me that even through their consultation process, where I think it's like a requirement, I'm probably going to screw this up, but that they notify the particular First Nations, with like a letter, and then, kind of have a conversation, and there's some chain of events. But what they have discovered is that really in that process, that there's some inequity in that, because these First Nations are getting maybe 300 or 400 notifications a year. And the capacity for some of the First Nations to even kind of process and understand what you want to consult about is a challenge in itself. And so, what that raised up for me is, again, it's what is the process or what is the approach that you're using to make sure that, one, folks can kind of absorb and participate, that even though you're going through this process, it might not be working in the way that it's intended to. So again, Rebecca, I don't know your process in terms of consultation, but I found that really interesting that yes, the government entity is doing what they're supposed to do, sending out this notice and going through the chain, but they've gotten some pushback in saying that, we can't possibly respond to all this. And it's not like we don't care, but, just our capacity. So, I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I would love to learn more about what the consultation process is, because, it seems like every time you begin, or every time I begin to ask questions with certain folks, that it's like, oh, well, we kind of never thought of that. And maybe there's a way to, make it more, I don't want to say easier, but, to kind of get what you want out of it, and not just you, but the other entity as well, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions that have come in the chat. One from Pascal Polinick. They mentioned really great talk. First of all, agreed. And they would be interested to hear more on the design and use of metrics. So what do you see as their role in implementing environmental justice in different decision-making organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. So, I'll speak from kind of the philanthropic standpoint and why. So one, and I heard this from my grantees, that their biggest fear in coming up with a set of metrics, they wanted to, because one, they wanted to really understand the impact that they were having as an entity. So these 35 organizations working on water equity, what were we doing? What were we accomplishing? And I think their biggest fear was that, I would use these metrics to kind of penalize them or not re-up their funding. So once we kind of got past what the utility of these metrics were, and that it was strictly to say, one, for me, I have my theory of change for this strategy. Is it making a difference? Which is really why I wanted to create the metrics. But for them, they wanted to know and understand, like, are we actually moving this field forward? So for me, the way those things were designed, these metrics were designed, it was a collective process. It was not Jalonne sitting in her office figuring out, well, what do I think is important? And so that process took some time. It was not easy because, especially when you have entities that are coming with these different perspectives. I mean, as a water utility, my care is about water rates, or, how many upsets I don't have, or how many gazillion gallons are coming into my treatment system. Whereas the community is like, I really wanted my green infrastructure here, or, how many times have I called and you not responded in the 411, whatever. So really trying to, this was probably a 7 or 8 month process where we had multiple meetings where people offered things that they were either tracking now, that they wanted to track, and then coming up with larger themes that, again, not everybody would be able to respond to, but at least a good number of folks could respond to, so then we could have, an appreciable amount of data. So that design process has to be, it has to be collaborative, and it's messy and hard because there's no standard for metrics and water equity or climate resilience. And so the intent was to create this for the field and start that. Now, in terms of the second part, in terms of implementing environmental justice in different decision-making organizations. So I'm working with a couple of large environmental nonprofits. And again, everybody is kind of, I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of folks are, again, beginning to ask this question, how do we think about environmental justice and what does that mean? And, what I will say is that, people in organizations are, again, looking at their strategies. And as much as you measure, how many followers you get on Twitter or whatever, it's not just these, people are moving away from just these simple kind of outcomes. Like, we had 25 community meetings. And not that isn't important, I don't want to minimize it, but kind of like the easy stuff to, like, for example, one of the metrics is, that we were thinking about, how many new partnerships have we helped develop? How many times in this past year have we incorporated a policy suggestion from an external EJ partner into our larger platform? How much money have we given to an environmental justice organization? So I think you don't know what you don't know. And while organizations now are trying to figure out, what are the things that they should be doing, and to hold themselves accountable, at least starting out with the base level of metrics is important. Not saying those metrics will last forever, but I think that is going to, what I'm seeing is that is going to begin to drive their decision-making in a different way that it's never shown up. Because again, I will speak from a little bit of experience. Oftentimes the relationships between environmental justice organizations and others has been very transactional, right? It's like, what can I take from and use and not put your name on it, but put our organization in, all that stuff. So I think this is a way, at least what I'm seeing, for them to hold these organizations to hold themselves accountable. And my hope, and something that I did while I was at WEAC, was really, having that same set of metrics that external organizations can then score you on as an organization. So if you say that you're like doing this equity and environmental justice thing, let us score you, not just internally. And so my hope is that we will get to that point, because I think, again, this whole notion of accountability is so critical, because we've gotten away with, and when I say, kind of large mainstream nonprofits, government entities, we've gotten away with a lot, unfortunately. I hope that helps.
Great answers. I love all of this discussion. I think that those of us could probably stay here all day and pick your brain, Dr. White-Newsome, because you have so much to tell us. But in the interest of time, since it is 3 o'clock, I know, I feel like time went by way too fast. I did want to ask the early career team if they wanted to take over and close us out, or if there was a second part for the early career section.
Hi. Yes, so I'm happy to take it from here. I don't know if we close out, if we just really want to thank Dr. White-Newsome again for the talk, and thank all of the participants for joining us today. And then just say that we'll transition over to the early career section, where we know our early career folks are interested in learning more about your career path and how you got to the jobs that you've had, and any advice you'd have to share. So I'll give folks maybe a few seconds. I see some thank yous and appreciation showing up there in the chat. So just for everyone to thank Dr. White-Newsome and to transition. And then I'm happy to take it on. So hi, everyone. I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Francisca Landis, and I'm one of the early career co-chairs for AGU GeoHealth. And think we'd being here, and we just want to transition to take this opportunity for our joint GeoHealth webinars to provide an insight to career opportunities for our early career membership. So with that, Dr. White-Newsome, if you don't mind to kind of start us off, I think, we're very excited to have you here, and as well for you to share your wealth of expertise in different types of career paths and jobs and industries, nonprofit, as well as academia. So I was wondering, could you start us off maybe with a bit of a overview of your career path and trajectory, maybe from graduation to, I know you mentioned the chemical industry, but maybe just kind of a brief overview of what your path was and it continues to be.
Sure. So I will try and not bore you and make this really brief. This is always really hard, because when I thought I would just be an engineer for like 30 years and then retire and do what I wanted to do. And that's not been the case. But I spent, 15 years working in manufacturing and chemical engineering, in different facilities, mostly chemical, some auto. And while I was working in Texas, I ended up getting my master's in environmental engineering, because I really, again, I was kind of end up in many cases being the environmental manager for many facilities, all the facilities that I worked in. So I left manufacturing and went to state government and for the state of Maryland. And I worked in air quality and radiation. But while I was there, they had started this Sustainable Communities Commission for Environmental Justice. I think I'm probably screwing it up, but basically kind of this statewide commission that worked on environmental justice issues. And so I actually volunteered with the Director of Environmental Justice for the state of Maryland, Department of the Environment. And so through that, I learned a lot, but then I also got a chance to become a lobbyist for the department in Annapolis. So I spent about 1.5 years lobbying on behalf of the Department of Environment. So left state government, and then I end up going back to Michigan, back into industry to start at a joint venture between Hyundai, Chrysler, and Mitsubishi. So it was a brand new facility, and I got a chance to build their environmental program from scratch. So I did environment and quality and a little bit of health and safety, and it was amazing. I got us down to be a zero waste to landfill facility, and did a lot of community engagement, all that good stuff. Then, decided when I had my first daughter that, I found out about this public health thing. I didn't know what public health was, but I was super interested, and, end up applying for a couple of schools, got in the University of Michigan, for their public health program, and end up again doing my research on climate change and extreme heat. Finished at U of M, then had an opportunity to go to DC and do my postdoc as a fellow, one of the first climate change fellows through the Kendall Fellowship at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And so I worked in their DC office, again, still researching extreme heat and health, but at the national level, but also getting a taste of being on Capitol Hill and kind of being a scientist, going to talk and chat with leaders. And that was just exciting and amazing to me. And while I was at UCS, a colleague of mine at the NAACP said, I think you might want to apply for this other position. They're getting ready to open this federal policy office. And that's when I kind of applied to be the director of federal policy for We Act for Environmental Justice. That was, again, it's been based in Harlem, New York for 30 plus years, but wanted to open up a DC office so we could have a persistent presence in DC on federal EJ policy. And so I led that office for several years. And again, another amazing experience, learned a lot. Then, the transition happened in DC, and I was grateful that the Kresge Foundation had reached out and they were looking for a program officer to kind of re-envision their work on sustainable water systems. And so again, built out the CRUISE initiative, but also they had hired me to work on their climate change, health, and equity initiative. So a bunch of acronyms, CRUISE and then CHE. And so again, had the opportunity to work in both of those spaces around climate, health, and equity, and climate and water, and spent a great 5 years at Kresge, and decided in early February that, it was really kind of time for me to step out on my own. Because, again, it's great working within institutions, but the autonomy and the need and kind of the freedom to really activate some of the solutions that I thought needed to really make the change. I thought I would have the more freedom to do it on my own. So my consulting practice, I've been at since February, and it has been amazing. It has been more work than I thought it would be. But it is all amazing work. And like I said, I'm working on water, I'm working on energy, working on climate, health. I mean, it is amazing. And this is just, it's been wonderful. So I will stop there because I feel like I talk too much, but that's kind of my circuitous path.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's always valuable for early career folks to see that path, because I think sometimes, when you're in grad school or an undergrad, it can be hard to envision all the opportunities that might still come and all the different ways one might end up, in those roles and transitioning between. So I think it's important for us to see what that can look like, so that we know those opportunities exist and, are encouraged to seek those out. So with that, I just wanted to briefly take a moment for a few housekeeping things. We have an account that says ask questions here as well. If you want to ask any questions in the chat for any of our audience members, that'll just help me pool the questions together while I'm trying to look at the chat and some of the questions that came in earlier. So feel free to ask any questions there, and we'll get those ported over. And then I know the original Zoom account or Zoom invitation was, I think, for an hour, but just for early career folks, we'll go on to the half hour, so 20 more minutes, just so you can know what time frame we're looking at. So one follow-up question, Dr. White-Newsome, after you talked about that transition was, that just a question more about your experience shifting from the engineering to that public health realm, and any advice you might have for folks who are in a physical science or an engineering field now, but are really interested in engaging more with public health in a way that supports justice and equity, and how that transition might be or how they might approach that transition. Or incorporate that into their current work, but through that lens a bit more.
Sure. And I would say that I totally, now that I think about it, I guess that was kind of a drastic transition Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, I didn't think that hard about it during the midst of it, but, you know, it was like, you know, I feel like that thread of justice and health, even though I hadn't named public health as a part of my work, had been a part of my work, you know, since, you know, I left undergrad. But I think with anything, you know, particularly for kind of physical sciences, folks in the physical sciences and hard sciences, you know, there are ways that you can incorporate stuff into your work, but there's also things that you can do outside of work. And even when I was in engineering, like straight engineering, I volunteered for so many different organizations. And that's where I was able to kind of, you know, fill my cup on the justice side. So when I was in Texas and working for this manufacturing facility, I was a volunteer with the National Society of Black Engineers, and they had an environmental justice special interest group. And the whole purpose of that group, which we set forth, was to support communities as they faced environmental justices, you know, throughout the state and really the region. So we provided technical assistance, we wrote up comments, we met with agencies, and this was all just on my volunteer time. But I think any way that you're able to, you know, because in reality, you have to pay the bills, right? So, you know, if you're able to bring that into your current work stream, great. But even if not, there's so many opportunities and organizations that would value your expertise that you can just use and kind of, one, help whatever organization or whatever entity, whatever you're passionate about. But it also gives you a sense of, man, you know, maybe this is something that I want to do, you know, on the next phase of my career. So I think, you know, whatever that transition looks like, you know, I have this plan. And was this a part of my plan? No. I think it's important to also be open to new experiences, because I really truly believe like where you're supposed to be, you know, those doors were open at the appointed time. And while it's important to network and, you know, and kind of put yourself in different circles and expose yourself to different things, you know, really be intentional about, okay, if I really want to, you know, figure out what this justice thing means or how I could use my skill set, you know, reach out to organizations that are in your community. And if you don't know any, reach out to me and I will help you identify, because there is always a need for support and capacity and technical assistance, or even just basic skills that you think, you know, it's like, oh, I do that, that are still super important to some of these organizations. So that's what I would encourage you to do. And my hope is that from that, you know, you'll kind of maybe figure out or be introduced to, you know, a path or an opportunity that might not have come across your plate in another way. But yeah.
No, thank you. That's extremely helpful. And I think, you know, just what you're saying about volunteering, putting yourself out there in different situations, that really can help you experience different things and meet new people and see what the different type of work can be. Right. And that, I think that different type of work actually really flows into the next question, which was about your day-to-day. What is your day-to-day work? This was originally still at the Kresge Foundation, but maybe you can speak briefly to the Kresge Foundation and then at your current consulting job, just for someone, you know, or for someone, a grad student, you know, what's the day-to-day in a nonprofit sector look like?
Yeah, so I might, well, I'll start with Kresge, because philanthropy is its own kind of special place, and every foundation is not the same. So I work for a national foundation, and probably the day-to-day operations would be different for a community foundation or a regional foundation. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there. But, you know, at a national foundation, a lot of my day was spent on phone calls, having conversations with potential grantees, with current grantees, you know, scoping out different work, or actually serving as a consultant to my grantees, helping them kind of problem solve and think through strategy, which was super exciting for me. Another part of my day, I would say, again, was internal meetings. So philanthropy does a lot of strategizing, to the point where it's like, okay, really, we're building another theory of change and we're doing this again. But that is a lot of time, a lot of internal meetings around strategy. I would also say part of what I tried to do was do a lot in the field of philanthropy. So I was the co-chair for the Health Environmental Funders Network, which is a partner serving organization, or we call it a PSO, but basically about 90 plus funders that focus on health and environmental funding, where we would have annual meetings. You know, I was, again, co-chair of the board, and really was a way to kind of it was like a community of practice for funders. And so it was several of those organizations that I held leadership positions in. So of course that takes time, but it also kind of gives you a sense of what's going on in the broader field, you know, build different colleagues and, you know, really learn about this practice of philanthropy, which no one really tells you about, which you don't really go to school for. And I at Kresge, I traveled a lot. I traveled a great deal. I was probably gone 2 to 3 times a month, whether it was visiting grantees on site, whether it was attending their events, speaking at their events, or speaking at other things, or attending, again, these partner serving organization meetings. That was a lot of my time. The rest of the time was spent, you know, I would say writing up grant reports or writing up grant requests, because when grantees, you know, are seeking support, we still have to internally kind of advocate for them to get funding. So I would have to kind of, you know, write it up in this pretty form and, you know, present it to management, and then they present it to our executive team. So every month we had a docket where we presented all the folks that we wanted to put forth for funding. And so not all foundations have a docket every month. That was pretty intense. So every month it was like you were going in front of the board to ask to support these organizations. So it was philanthropy. I guess my thing is there's this, and I'll say this because it's some, you know, that's like this perception that, you know, philanthropy is like this very cushy job, and it can be, but I guess for me, if you're doing it right, it's the hardest job you'll ever have. Particularly if you are trying to, which was my reason for going to philanthropy, was to, one, figure out how it worked, and then figure out how I could get resources to low-income communities and communities of color and organizations that were doing ridiculous amounts of work and had been severely underfunded for many years. So it can be cushy and nice, but if you're doing it with some intention, it can be hard work, but I would say very worthwhile. So that was kind of my stint in philanthropy. That helps.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of writing and communication skills and
Yes.
moving that forward. Thank you. And so one of the questions, we talked a lot about climate change, or you talked a lot about climate change research and equity. So one of the questions was, how did you manage or maintain that research during this job? Or I know you still have an adjunct position. So how do you manage doing that? And do you incorporate that work so that it's really, you know, two things are the same? And how or how important have you felt to maintain that adjunct position, to be able to do that research through that arm? Can you speak a little bit to your experience doing that as well?
Yeah, so I'm just a little bit loony. I'll start with that. How do I say it? Like, people say, well, how do you balance life and work? I don't believe it's a balance. I believe there is a harmony that you just try and keep in tune with, because some things are going to take more of your time at one point in your life and some things are not. I've been an adjunct professor or lecturer, whatever you want to call it, at GW, George Washington University, for the past 9 years. And to me, that was important because I really enjoy teaching. I just didn't want to do it full time. And so that is something that has been super cool. I've also been able to connect and stay connected with my doctoral advisor, who has made it, like, I would say, really easy for me to engage in research. So it's not like I have the time to, do some intense data cleaning, and, it's like, so bringing me in more so in a consultant research capacity into different projects, because I still want to stay in tune with what's going on. But of course, working at the foundation, most recently, and, it was just too much to juggle. So I really had and still have a great set of colleagues that pull me in on different projects where it makes sense and where I could provide some feedback. But now as a consultant, I am actually doing that research. So it is really cool, because now I have like the best of both worlds. Like, I'm still in practice, so actually helping people solve problems that are like making changes now, but then also doing research in areas. And I have several research assistants that are helping, because me trying to like figure out GIS now or create a SAS program, it would just be a waste of everybody's time. So I feel like, I can kind of create the strategy and the vision, but I have great graduate students that are kind of like helping make that happen. And it also gives them an opportunity to learn about consulting, to be a part of a project that again, is going to make a difference, because a lot of my projects are very like, okay, we need this in like 2 or 3 months, or we need it now, and this is going to inform this policy or this thing. So I won't say that it's a balance, but it's like, the biggest question right now for me is, as in my consulting practice, is, I need to grow, or I need to say no. And it's like, I didn't think that I would be at this point now, but I'm looking for a part-time staffer, as well as I have a lot of work for many graduate students, again, that are the master's at doctoral level, because there's no way I can do everything myself and still, want to maintain, the teaching, and I teach, usually 1 or 2 courses a semester, which is great. And then again, engage in the research that, that is lovely, and that I'm actually, kind of getting paid to do now. But I probably would have done it anyway. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, that's very, very inspirational. And I think a question that likely came up with that as well is, what soft skills do you recommend early career people develop for their career?
Yeah, my goodness. So you have to learn how to communicate, and not just the one-way communication, but actually listening. So talking and listening is critical. Facilitation is something that, again, I was never taught or went to a formal training, but in this work around climate and in this work around justice, you are oftentimes in rooms with a whole bunch of different types of folks, and being able to kind of create a safe space, but a brave space for folks to be able to share and kind of generate ideas, but actually move things forward is super important. So facilitation skills, I think, are critical. Definitely in terms of writing and being able to communicate, again, is big. I would say between communication and facilitation, those are the 2 things that I was never really taught in school, but have, I would say, learned over time, some best practices and things like that.
Great, fantastic, thank you. And I think there's actually a great question here that just came in through the chat as well, which is, how do you balance your research interests and working directly with policy and action? I'm fairly certain I want to get a PhD, but I want to end up in the science and policy advocacy space. I wonder how you feel that getting a PhD has been useful and valued in that work. And that was a question from the chat.
Yeah, so I would say, very personally, as a woman and a woman of color, the PhD has been super valued, because again, it kind of validates you And I hate to say that a degree has to validate you, but I'm just being real. I really, if it wasn't for a mentor of mine, I probably wouldn't have this PhD. When I was working in the manufacturing plant in Michigan, a mentor of mine who is still to this day, she was the first head of the mechanical engineering department at Kettering University in Flint, Michigan. And she said to me, you really need to think about getting a PhD. She would just keep on harping. And I'm like, I don't want to go back to school. I don't want to just like research for the fun of it, you know. And I really understand now why she said that, because it has opened up and continues to open up so many doors. And when you think about, you know, whether you decide to do policy or things of that nature, you know, just having that level of analysis, being able to, you know, kind of, you know, even as you think about how you create your research plan, that was helpful for me as I created campaign strategies. So all these skills that you develop, you know, at least in my experience, through my PhD experience, you know, are so transferable in so many different ways. So I don't think you can go wrong, you know, with the PhD and thinking about policy or whatever else. You know, I would just, what would I say? Yeah, I mean, I don't regret it. I'm trying to think if it's anything else that I would add to that. The PhD has been super helpful. I think one of the things that continue to, you know, always, whenever I would just say this whole concept of humility is super important, because whether you're doing policy or whether you're, you know, thinking about working in community, sometimes your degree can, how can I say this? People stereotype you, right? So they will automatically assume that you, I don't know, have no concept of humanity. And it's all about like the data and the science and all this stuff. So I would say that's the one thing that I've had to kind of like overcome, or just like let folks know, like, no, you got me characterized wrong. So, you know, with that validation and kind of the like of having the PhD, you know, when you are interfacing in certain circles, you know, there is some sense of humility that you need to carry in there, to sometimes, I don't want to say put people at ease, but just really let them know that you are human, and, you know, there is another dimension to you that you're bringing to this space, as you do whatever you're doing, writing policy, talking about solutions, you know, having a dialogue. So yeah, you know, I felt like I rambled, but I'm happy to to chat offline.
No, thank you. That's extremely helpful. And I think definitely something that a lot of us might be able to relate to, or hope to be able to relate to in the future. And so I just want to do a time check. I think got 1 minute left here, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So just wanted to give you an opportunity to see if there are any last minute advice. I mean, we're in a kind of a GeoHealth group here, looking at this interdisciplinary work, right, of looking at health and environmental science, and really trying to bring, you know, I think when you look at the health lens, you really see the need for the equity lens as well, and bring that all together. So any last minute advice for us navigating this interdisciplinary career space and moving forward?
Keep it going. Like, we cannot continue to do our work and think and function in silos. Everything is connected. And so much gratitude to each of you all that have taken on, like, I never knew what GeoHealth was, to be really honest. And so the fact that there is a space where folks are thinking about this connectedness, and that's so important. So continue to push it, continue to use this whole kind of framework or intersectionality in your work, and to continue to support each other. I think that's super important. And one of the things that I was sharing with someone yesterday is that, you know, we're all super smart people in our own way, but none of us alone have all the answers. So when you talk about the importance of community, whether it's the AGU community, whether it's the physical community that you live in, make sure that you are reaching out and helping each other. That's so important. Like, we don't have to do this alone. And tackling climate change is not anything that one person can do alone. So you know something that I don't know, and I might know something that you don't know. So let's, really begin to work together, because that's the only way we're going to tackle this big stuff: racism, climate change, institutional change, all that stuff. So I would just encourage you to keep on doing what you're doing and support each other.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. White-Newsome. I think on that note of supporting each other and building community and working forward, we'll wrap it up and keep that momentum going forward throughout our day and our summer and our year. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today again, and thank you for your time so much on a Friday afternoon. And we look forward to all the ongoing work and community that we can build together. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.